Welcome, everyone. Happy Friday, July 7th, 2023. Lots of interesting news today. Nothing groundbreaking, but some little interesting thought nuggets. And I really would love everyone who's here to chime in the chat on some of the stories that we have today, because we also have a fantastic guest in Michelle Weekly, who's going to be coming up in a couple of minutes after I get my little intro out of the way. And yeah, so we're going to be covering today the next steps in the BlackRock Bitcoin ETF approval. We're going to be talking about what happens if you give Bitcoin to an AI bot, because there have been some major breakthroughs in the last 24 hours in some of the SDKs around that. We're going to be talking about some spying surveillance stuff going on in France amidst the kind of violent protests there. And then we're going to be also talking about Canadian versus American mortgage regulations and the different rules around that and how that kind of impacts and shapes our respective housing markets. Because while almost everything culturally and financially is pretty similar across Canada and America, if you dive into mortgages and how loans work, they are drastically different and held to much different standards. And so, us Canadians, we're always complaining about the rent prices here. Americans have similar rent prices, I have learned recently, but their incomes are different. And so housing is not always the biggest topic of conversation in America. And some of the things that I've dug into around mortgage regulations between the two countries kind of shine some light on that. So before we start, if you could give the video a like and a share, if you want some other people to see it, I'd super appreciate it. Helps it get it out to more people. And quick shout out to our sponsor for this video, Beaver Bitcoin, which is the easiest way to dollar cost average Bitcoin in Canada, straight from your bank account, no touching any exchanges. I'll play their little ad here first, and then we'll dive into it. This week's show is brought to you by Beaver Bitcoin. Dollar cost averaging is the most stress-free method to enter the Bitcoin space. And if you're looking for a simplified way of buying Bitcoin in Canada without needing to rely on a custodial exchange, Beaver Bitcoin is your best bet. Beaver Bitcoin lets you set up recurring Bitcoin purchases directly from your Canadian bank account and straight into a Bitcoin address that you control. It's like a savings account in a currency that you actually want, or a Netflix subscription that doesn't suck. And if you don't want to wait to stack sats, Beaver Bitcoin supports instant non-custodial Bitcoin buying via e-transfer as well. Give it a shot today at beaverbitcoin.com. Alrighty, so let's dive into the charts really quick. I don't want to hang up too much on this. But another interesting week in Bitcoin. Actually, if you look at the charts on the weekly, it's kind of boring. We keep brushing up against this 31,500 mark. That's kind of the level that we kind of need to break out of in order for this thing to really start ripping. And so my call for this year, not that I have a crystal ball, my call for this year has always been that I don't think Bitcoin makes all-time highs this year. I think the bottom for the next 3 years or so has probably been set with the FTX thing. And my call would be, I think this year we're going to end up somewhere in this range by December. And we've broken into it, and I've had these up, I think, for a while, maybe not. But yeah. One of the more interesting things to watch for this week. So we've had this grind up market in equities for most of 2022. It's kind of been brutal because a lot of people have been sidelined. And people are wondering, like, what's the next pin to drop? We had the banking crisis. Everything's kind of been up only since then. When's the next shoe going to drop from that situation? And I can't tell you that. But one of the things that I think you have to start looking into is the VIX, the volatility index. That has just broken down to lows not seen since before the pandemic. And structurally, when you break out of a range like this, it takes some time to get back into it. And especially if it's on a bearish sentiment. We saw a little bit of a spike here this week. I kind of missed if there was anything particular relating to that, but it's obviously faded all the way back. So again, if you want to get bearish, you have to have some, wind in your sails. And I just don't see that right now. So I'm not particularly looking at the market across equities or Bitcoin topping out anytime soon. I think we're going to have to hear something happen. Otherwise, the money printer keeps burning and it keeps funneling right into hard and harder assets. All right, enough of me talking about technicals. Let's bring up Michelle here. She's going to help me narrate the news for the week. Michelle, how's it going?
Good. How are you?
Fantastic. For the people in the audience who don't know who you are, maybe you could just give a quick introduction in your background in the Bitcoin and finance space.
Sure. So I've been in the Bitcoin space since 2016, 2017. I'm relatively new to Twitter, but I am now best known on Twitter mostly because I was living and working in the Middle East, in Dubai, and spent a lot of time in China. So that's kind of a unique perspective. I live in the States. I moved back to the States in 2018. And I do business and product development. I'm working with a company in the Bitcoin space right now.
Awesome. Yeah, I've noticed Bitcoiners have these arcs, which is like you find out about it, you put a chunk of your net worth into it, and you become a full-on Bitcoin believer. But this cycle, the next part of that journey seems to be continuing in that people are finding jobs in the Bitcoin space. If they're not building Bitcoin products, they're aligning themselves with companies that are building that vision. So that's awesome that you're fully now deep in the trenches, right?
Yeah, I'm really excited for the opportunity. To get out of I was in marketing and business development in the fiat world that is just it's like a race to the bottom. So I'm super excited to be out of it and be building in Bitcoin and in that ecosystem.
Awesome. All right. So first piece of news we're going to talk about today is Gemini versus DCG. So just a quick summary for the audience who doesn't know. This is just continued fallout from all the stuff last year with, one second here. This is continued fallout from the whole Terra Luna, Three Arrows Capital, the contagion aftermath. And so most of the companies, BlockFi, Celsius, they're all going through their Chapter 11 bankruptcy. But a company that was really affected by the massive losses accrued there was also Digital Currency Group, which owns Grayscale Bitcoin Trust and a Bitcoin lending market maker platform. Does a lot of things called Genesis. And so Genesis was one of the counterparties for a lot of these yield platforms. So when you lent out Bitcoin to BlockFi or you lent it out to Celsius or Gemini Earn, which is about this story, they would take that money, they would lend it out to Gemini and, they'd lend it. They both have like the same names. I'm going to mix it up, but Gemini would lend out your Bitcoin that you gave to them to Genesis. They would pay Gemini 6%, and then Gemini would give you 4%, and that would be your yield. And they did that with all sorts of currencies. And what happened is through the FTX, through the all insolvency stuff, they ended up having a massive hole in their balance sheet. But rather than be truthful about it, the Winklevi are claiming that the parent company, DCG, wrote a promissory note to Genesis to basically cover that gap. So they wrote a note to kind of patch over their $1 billion hole in their balance sheet rather than actually fix the hole itself. And they did this so they would look good in the eyes of Gemini and all the other parties they were borrowing from. And so Gemini continued to lend to them, even though they were a little bit worried. Genesis said, oh, no, we're fine. We're solving all that. And then comes out in January earlier this year that Genesis is pretty much insolvent. And I don't know if they've officially undergone bankruptcy, but they're obviously, a lot of funds are locked up there. And the big fallout from all this on the retail side is that the Gemini Earn customers, of which I think there were around 1 million, are, crap out of luck for any crypto that they ended up lending out on that platform. And the Winklevi are notorious for really pursuing a legal route to cryptocurrencies. They paid millions of dollars of ads around New York City that say make crypto compliant. And so it's kind of a black mark on their reputation that they ended up getting so much of their customer base involved with this counterparty that is not acting responsibly. And so now they've finally gone forward. They were trying to give, Genesis some time to kind of get their stuff together. But finally, they got sick of waiting, and they're going forward with a fraud lawsuit to try and get some settlements here. So yeah, it's a tangled web of a lot of different counterparties. But Michelle, you've seen this whole industry play out, and it's kind of interesting to see now. I think you got FTX; they're talking about reopening their exchange. All the other ones are trying to settle whatever balances they have with their customers. I think Voyager is now giving some crypto back. How do you think this whole thing's going to pan out? Do you think the Winklevi are going to win this, or do you think Genesis is, going to get away with it again?
I don't know. It's really hard to say, isn't it? I mean, the lesson ultimately for retail, which hopefully everyone by now has learned, is if you don't know where the yield is coming from, don't participate in it. And
if you don't know where the yield is coming from, you are the yield.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
I would really like to think that on a more institutional level, that the Winklevoss twins, like given their background, understood more deeply what was happening. But if you take everything they're saying at face value, then it kind of leads you to believe that perhaps they didn't. And I don't know. I don't know if I believe that. It's hard to say.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I think of all the people you could have lent to, and I don't know, the background details. A lot of these companies are just working, with market makers and not with retail, right? So
Yeah.
if you look at all of them, I think Genesis did look the most legitimate. They were part of, Barry Silbert's gang of companies, and they've been doing things pretty by the books for a while now. But yeah, it's heating up, and I think the reason that some people take interest in this story is that if the Winklevi potentially win, one of their demands is that some of the Bitcoin in the GBTC trust get unlocked to cover some of the losses accrued by Genesis. And so there's a fear that, that could just mean that like there's a flood of supply, because I think GBTC holds something like 6% or 5% of all the Bitcoin, maybe a bit less by now, but it's
Yeah,
a
I'm not sure
reasonable amount.
exactly what the percent is, but that would certainly be interesting. I mean, GBTC in and of itself has been interesting to watch. I think it was at like a 40% under market, like a 40% discount at some point, and that has
Yeah.
sort of corrected, but that in and of itself is an interesting story. But if they have to release some of that, then I don't think that that's good for anybody really. I would have
I
really liked to seen the debate. I don't know that there was any chance that debate happened live on Spaces, but that would have been pretty interesting for all of us to watch.
Yeah. I don't think there's any way Barry was gonna put himself out there. A
No.
really good interview to kind of see and get a feeling for Genesis is Peter McCormack interviewed, I think his name is Barry Sonnenschein, or the CEO of Genesis. Peter McCormack interviewed him and really like held his feet to the fire, and it's a fantastic piece of journalism.
I've not seen that.
Um,
I'll have to look that up.
Yeah, super, super worth watching if you care about all this drama. I guess the big question from all this is like, to be honest, like there was really only one company that didn't go belly up, and I'm not gonna brag, but they were like the one that sponsored my show at one point, which was Ledin. They were the only lending platform that didn't go belly up, and I've met the CEO, and he's still going around, and they're still operational. And that's because essentially they were just over collateralizing every single loan that they had. So there was never any of these like uncollateralized loans going out to these trusted third parties like Three Arrows Capital.
Right.
And I kind of wonder, like, if we move in this hyper Bitcoinized world, um, I still think we're going to have lending, because you're going to have people who come into economies with basically nothing and have no,
Right.
kind of equity. And I think they're going to need startup capital. But I wonder how, feasible it is, and what kind of things you have to institute to have lending work under a sound money standard where, insurance can't bail these things out if they go belly up.
Yeah, I think I agree with you that ultimately a lot of the sort of traditional financial mechanisms are going to be sort of rewired and function on a Bitcoin standard. And it may just be that the loans are really, like you said, over collateralized, and that's the answer. That if you don't have enough to cover, the swings, then you don't hold enough value on a hard money standard to get a loan. So the
Hmm.
standards are obviously going to be a lot higher, but to me, that's a good thing. I think we've seen what quote unquote free money is doing. It's allowing for the prop up of all of these nonsense things happening in the tech world. Um,
Hmm.
so a lot of people kind of argue against access to capital being harder and harder, but I think that there's a balance in there and that it's not necessarily a bad thing.
Yeah, I think it's going to qualify, the ideas of the next generation of entrepreneurs a lot more, because when you can borrow money at 1%, why not take a risk on just about everything? Because
Right.
it's like all great venture capitalists say, like, I don't care if 9 out of 10 of my businesses fail. The one that I do invest in will pay for the failures. And, while that sounds good in concept, you really should have a better hit rate than that?
Absolutely. I
So,
worked at a lot of tech startups like through from 2010 into, the end of almost 2020. And so many of them had so much money. It was just insane. And as
Mhm.
fun as it was to kind of experience that and be part of that, it's not a solid way to build an economy.
Yeah, 100%. All right, moving on to the next little story we got here. This is not like a big story, but we know that BlackRock has been pursuing this Bitcoin ETF, and they finally got Larry Fink on TV to talk about it. And he was saying, a few things. Bitcoin is an international asset. People do look at it as a form of digital gold, maybe hedging against inflation, really validating the asset. Not only, not just like about 6 years ago, it was a scam, according to him. But one of the things that I liked from his quote, and I don't believe the BlackRock part, but the foundation of BlackRock is about hope. You invest for retirement because you believe tomorrow is better than today. So I would just replace the word BlackRock with Bitcoin, and I would just replace the word invest in this sentence for savings, right? And that's kind of the ethos of Bitcoin, is like, we don't need to have all these different exotic investment products. We can just have a hard money, and that does the trick. What do you think of this whole thing? Are you pro BlackRock getting into this space? Do you think there's like a malicious intent to have this ETF control things from the inside or outside? What's your kind of stance on everybody talking about this so much these days?
So I feel like I have a really balanced stance on this, in the sense that I've been waiting for institutional money to come in for a while. I think that it was absolutely inevitable that institutional money wanted to come in and have exposure in, through various vehicles. The ETF makes a lot of sense. So I think everything is good for Bitcoin. I don't believe some of these nefarious narratives that they're going to somehow fork Bitcoin and do all sorts of crazy things. I think there are a lot of people who want exposure to Bitcoin and understand that it's a growing asset class that is generally accepted as legitimate now, but are maybe not in a place where they're ready to buy Bitcoin and go through that whole process in amongst themselves. They want to be able to call their financial advisor and say, get me exposure to Bitcoin. And I know a lot of people are really against that narrative, but I think if you kind of step away from Twitter and talk to people who are not involved in the space in any way, there's such a huge divide. It takes years to learn and understand Bitcoin in a way that you're comfortable, like buying it on exchange, holding it. Um, and people are going to have to learn that one by one. I don't think it's a bad thing. I think everything is good for Bitcoin. It gives it a lot of legitimacy as an asset class, and there are just going to be some people who want exposure that way.
Yeah, I think, prior, like in 1971, when they took Bitcoin, or no, sorry, when they took Bitcoin off the gold standard, when they took money off the gold standard, it took a while for gold to really get securitized and to make it into people's portfolios. And that there was like this whole silver and gold boom, and people were getting exposure to silver and gold in the 80s by buying these mining companies. And so, like, you had the Hunt brothers and all this stuff. And then I think it was I think it was shortly after 2008 that the first spot gold ETFs came out, and you just saw this wall of capital move into it, and that was kind of the
Right.
the reason that asset class 10x'd. Gold went from like 200 to 1700 in like 2 or 3 years because of the inflows. And I mean, gold I think is still barely over that 2011 high. And so there's one side of the argument, which is like all this, fresh capital can come into Bitcoin because now you have a way of adding it into your brokerage or your 401k in a direct manner. You're not buying some derivative mining company. But there's the other side of the argument, which is that they're going to use this to inevitably print, paper Bitcoins. And, there's a couple arguments against that. One of them is that, we can't audit the supply of gold. It's not very transparent, but we can track, is BlackRock really taking possession of these Bitcoins off of Coinbase or not, right? Like, enough chain
Right.
analysis can find you the answer for some of that. Um, do you think that there is a mechanism or a way for them to use spot ETFs to suppress the price of Bitcoin, or do you think it's kind of, I guess, irrelevant?
I really don't. I mean, I think BlackRock is obviously a market maker, and who's to say for sure what they would or wouldn't do, but they want into Bitcoin because it's going to make them money and it's going to make their customers money. That's all that they care about. This
Mhm.
whole thing about hope is laughable. I think anybody that's on Twitter understands how laughable that is. And don't get me wrong, like I'm not buying any shares of BlackRock's ETF, but let them give people, institutional access and exposure. Like you said, it's pretty easy to track whether or not they are holding the Bitcoin. So, you know, I
Yeah.
don't think they're going to suppress the price. I think all they want to do, the only thing they care about is the price going up. So, what's the
Mhm.
motivation for them doing that?
And ultimately, like the reason that everyone got so gaga, I think, about these gold ETFs is it was so hard to take possession of it. And while financial advisors might not have like a great regulatory framework for just holding Bitcoin in like a single sig or multi sig on behalf of their clients, if they believe it's worth allocating into Bitcoin, then the client can just, figure out the rest. They can just pull out the cash and do it. But I think this gives the seal of approval of it as an asset to so many financial managers. And again, nobody wants to be first, but nobody wants to be last, right? And so I think rather than, everybody now has like a small allocation of gold in their portfolio, everyone's going to have a small allocation of this BlackRock Bitcoin ETF. I don't think it'll weigh the same where the ratio of like gold paper holders to gold physical holders, that's
Yeah.
not going to translate to, paper Bitcoin holders and real Bitcoin holders. I think you'll see a rush of people have their only Bitcoin exposure be something like the BlackRock ETF. But I think over time, they will take possession of it as all these stories come out that inevitably will about the risks in trusting people with your assets that are counterparties, right? Mortgages, other physical assets are like, there's a story every year about a counterparty not living up to their duty and either losing everything for their customers or having to get bailed out by the government. And the novelty of Bitcoin is you can take all the counterparty risk off and just be your own bank.
Absolutely.
All right. This is an interesting question. We got a response here from Akiko. I asked the chat. I can't pull out the results of the poll, but I asked the chat, how do you feel about AI bots denominating and earning Bitcoin? Because it's a very real thing now that you don't just have this passive chat GPT that you kind of just input all your questions and desires into, and it gives you answers. You have the collaboration of some of these AI bots, which have judgment on their own and maybe have goals of their own or are programmed with goals of their own. And they are going out and they're making businesses and they're trying to create products and things like that. And that will only develop over time. And I think there's kind of this idea that, if I was an AI putting myself into a robot's shoes, why would I want to invest so much time into building wealth that can just be taken away at the snap of a human's fingers? I would want a sound money standard. And so, as we move forward into this world of AI, I think it's very plausible that if they live amongst us autonomously, they are going to be big proponents of Bitcoin as their monetary standard. And so recently, a new standard has been released that connects AI as a SDK to some of these Bitcoin Lightning nodes and Bitcoin Lightning projects like LN-Bits. So Lightning Labs here has announced a new set of tools to build Lightning and Bitcoin-powered AI products for a global audience using L402, a standard for API authentication with LN payments, and LangChain, a simplified AI app framework. They're opening AI for all. And so I asked the question, are we positive about this? Are we negative about this? Mikiko says that it doesn't, in the sense that I do believe that Bitcoin is a future currency. Allowing AI to earn money independently would give them a sense of autonomy. And I'm reading these backwards, but AI earning, spending, saving in Bitcoin does and doesn't scare me. It scares me in the sense that the AI might assert themselves and have more property than humans. But inevitably, we are all going to be on that same standard. Michelle, how do you feel about this? Do you see this as like almost like too out there, or a very real thing that AI amongst us will be living and earning Bitcoin, and they'll be much better at handling their wallets than we will up to this point?
So I'm not going to lie, I'm kind of terrified of this. I've been in tech for 20 years and I like to think that I'm generally an early adopter of things. But And I'm the only one that I know really that feels this way. Everyone else I know is super bullish on AI and let's use it for everything. And this is so exciting. But I don't know. I'm a little bit terrified of it. And you add in the concept of it like making its own money. I don't like it. I just don't like it.
I think it's difficult because we ultimately, like, it's the opposite of most Bitcoiners saying, like, Bitcoiners want, egalitarian societies. But when it comes to AI, even like the most libertarian of us, we want to have an off switch on the AI and we want to have dominance and control over them. And, even most libertarians want some regulation. We want to have that off switch. At the same time, we want a sovereign financial instrument. And we don't want rampant tokenization of, AI, Ethereum, or whatever, right? So, naturally, we should be for them adopting Bitcoin. But you're right, it's a very scary proposal in that you got maybe an AI that's just very, very good at creating certain types of businesses. And for them, if they are, AI with Bitcoin maxi sensibilities, they will just store it and store it and store it. And it becomes this looming threat of this, potential bad actor that we have to worry about. And then, I think that harkens back to, that's a big concern some people have in their Bitcoin journey is like, well, what about all these whales? If hyper Bitcoinization is a thing and they're all, cult like Michael Saylor and they own 1% of the Bitcoin supply, like, couldn't these people be our future overlords? Like, do we want Michael Saylor owning 1% of all human capital and ingenuity in the world?
Right.
It may not be our place to say, if other humans deserve that, but certainly you would think that we should have a say on whether or not robots should have all that capital, right?
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I mean, you know, at least the humans in some sense have earned it, or built structures that have earned it, or I don't know. There's an autonomy in a person acquiring that Bitcoin, right? But the AI, I mean, where is it actually going, and what are they going to do? And I think that there's a much, much more legitimate fear of AI trying to fork Bitcoin than there is BlackRock. I mean, what does BlackRock care? They're trying to make money, but you take AI, who just has ultimately the goal of acquiring this asset. Um, I don't know. I've seen, a lot of people are like Elon is kind of polarizing right now, but Elon has made a number of statements that he thinks that AI development should be halted. And I don't know if I agree with that fully, but I think there's certainly concerns that should be examined, especially before we just open it up to earning its own money.
Hmm. And like one of the things, that people fall into when they first learn about Bitcoin is they think, well, if someone just gains 51% of the mining power, they can just override the network. And it's like the Bitcoiners know it's not about the miners, it's about the nodes.
Sure.
And the potential for AI to spin up nodes that we perhaps can't identify as real users
Right.
is problematic, right? And I think that is a potential to override the network. If the majority of nodes are accepting, malicious transactions or spammy transactions in the blockchain, it overwhelms everyone else's nodes. And we have to figure out, are they all working on one team? How do we filter this, right?
Right. Yeah. How do we
So,
figure that out? Like, if you look at the news that you're reading, I mean, even the articles that you're pulling up, how many of those are being generated by AI? And can you
yeah.
tell?
Hmm.
And if you can't tell, we've had AI. I mean, Chat GPT 4, I don't know exactly how long that's been out, but this is all developing rapidly over months and weeks. And so it's really in its infancy. And
Hmm.
just consider that you can't even tell at this point what news is and isn't written by AI. So
Yeah.
you really have no idea what it can do in the future, or pretend to be doing, or mimic, or otherwise create all of these systems that we're totally unaware of and unable to examine.
Hmm. And this is why, like, at large, like, I love this idea of digital property ownership. That's what Bitcoin pioneered. But we've got a lot of people, and there is almost a honeypot that if everyone is putting all of their, property and assets into something digital, a vast majority, and anything happens to that honeypot, we're left stranded in the physical world. And I think, Bitcoiners as a collective should take it upon themselves at some point when this grows really successful to, secure physical property, whether it's land, whether it's armaments, whether it's, whatever, as almost a hedge to over digitalization.
I don't disagree with that at all. I have tweeted several times that you cannot have enough Bitcoin land or ammo.
Nice. I like that. I'm in Canada, so we're not allowed to have any ammo on
You'll
the
just have
books.
to come down and hang out with your American friends when things really start to collapse.
Yeah. Yeah. Get protected on the ranches there.
Yeah.
All right. This one you told me you have some opinions on. This is in France. They've been having, these pretty insane, I don't want to say insane, just pretty rough protests. If we know one thing about the French, they know their revolts and revolutions. And for those who are not up to date on this story, there was a shooting by the police of a 17-year-old boy a couple weeks ago, kind of similar to the George Floyd, incident 2 years ago in the U.S. But the French people have taken this to a much bigger level than those protests in the United States, and so now the French government, in in an act of insecurity, I would say more than anything, they're trying to tap into people's phones, and I believe they actually just passed a bill, or they were granted authority in France to remotely access people's cell phone cameras, microphones, and GPSs as part of a justice reform bill. And so, Michelle, I want to let you take this one and maybe explain from a first principles perspective why this is a dangerous precedent for any government to set.
So this precedent, and a lot of people don't realize this precedent has already been set in the US, and it was set 20 years ago. After 9/11, the US passed the US Patriot Act, and not long after that, they established the Department of Homeland Security. And those two things have really allowed the US government on the federal level to spy on Americans in a way that they have absolutely no idea that the capability exists, let alone the regularity with which that it's happening. I think people are starting to wake up a little bit in the US, but I would say that most people in the US are going to read that headline about what's happening in France, and they're going to say, oh my gosh, I can't believe that's happening. I can't believe that they would allow for that, and sort of come from this place of surprise, because most of them are very uninformed about the fact that it is happening here. If you've ever tweeted anything, if you've ever emailed anything that has brought up a red flag, then there's somebody somewhere analyzing everything you've ever said. So the precedent really has already been set. What makes me nervous is historically the EU has had much stricter privacy standards. And so for them to pass this, and it's my understanding that they did pass it, that it was sort of set as an emergency measure. And so it's like live and happening, and that they are using the ability to turn the phones on, or to activate the cameras and the speakerphone, to track people down in real time. And of course, there are all of these quote unquote limitations set, that, you have to be a danger to society and all of these things. But like we saw during the COVID lockdowns, you guys saw with the trucker protests in Canada, that definition is very, very gray, and they can deem you a terrorist in the blink of an eye. So I'm kind of black pilled on this. I lived in DC for many, many, many years. I worked in big tech there. I've seen a lot of stuff. And it has definitely black pilled me, but what can you do? So I like to think that I'm an advocate against all of this, but in the same sense, I think I see it more as advocacy for awareness, because I don't, I think that the precedent has been set for so long that there's really no fighting it. It is a matter of fact in the US, and it has become a matter of fact in the EU. So the more awareness that we can create, the more of a chance that we might stand in getting some of these things reversed. I don't think they can be stopped. They've already been happening for much longer than people have any idea.
I think like privacy, much like all rights, it's really hard to get people to want to educate themselves and want to fight for them unless they start to feel like they've been violated or lost in some way.
Yeah,
And so like these headlines will come out, but the majority of people who are not, actively being spied on and persecuted for any
right.
reason don't have much reason to care. And that's a problem that just plagues human nature. We're very reactionary. We don't think super far in advance about things all the time. And, it's like, how do you get people to be more aware of their privacy before it gets violated? Because I think that's one of the hard challenges is like when your monetary rights get violated nowadays, I think in a matter of days you can get orange pilled and become a Bitcoiner. But when your privacy rights become violated, it's impossible to know where to start. It's like, okay, well, now I know that the government is snooping in my phone, and maybe like I just got evidence that they took some information from me, or maybe it was a corporation. And so what do you start to do? Throw out your phone,
Right.
turn off your computer, put duct tape over all the cameras around you. It's like, it's freaky and it's daunting. And it's, I guess money is very similar to that. That can be a hard process to just move to a Bitcoin standard, but having privacy violated, it seems people care less and less now too, because we are moving into this world where just like everything is live streamed and,
Right.
everyone is putting themselves out there because they feel like they need to do that as part of a social construct just to keep up with their peers. So yeah, it's,
Yeah.
yeah,
A
it's
lot
tough.
of people, way too many people, will just tell you, I don't have anything to hide. And I just want to like shake these people to their core, because it's not necessarily about hiding anything. It's about, if and when the government comes in and decides that you're some sort of threat, they're going to create whatever narrative they want. And we saw that happen here in the States with the January 6th protest or whatever you want to call it. They targeted a lot of people who really didn't do anything, but they're able
Hmm.
to take information and create essentially any evidence that they want. But I do agree with you; it is very difficult to get people to care until it affects them. Um, but I'm not going to stop screaming about it.
No, we got to do it. All right. You got what, about 5 minutes or so?
I have 12 minutes. I am good
Okay,
until
cool.
5.
All right, I'll try and make this quick. So you are based out of the US. So I'll just ask you, have you dealt with applying or getting a mortgage ever down there?
I do have a mortgage. And I was super lucky that I got a mortgage when interest rates were still really low. I knew
Mhm.
nothing about it. I'd lived abroad until 2018. I came back to the States, bought a house in 2019 here in Florida, and honestly just got lucky. I knew absolutely nothing. I have since learned a lot and have learned how lucky I was to just happen to apply for a mortgage at the time that I did. That's the
So
limit.
what I've heard and from what I've read, and I don't know if it's, the standard down there, but usually when Americans get mortgages, they get a fixed 30 year. Is that what you got if you're at liberty to tell?
Yeah, I guess I don't mind. You can there's fixed mortgages, which is what I have, and generally that's what people will opt for when interest rates are low. As the
Hmm.
interest rates have sort of skyrocketed, people are taking out I think it's a variable. I don't even know the technical
Yeah.
name for it, but it's like a variable interest rate. And so the idea being that, it changes with the rates, but then when things stabilize or the rates go back down, you can remortgage and secure a lower rate. Um,
Hmm.
so I think those are risky. There's people that have mortgage rates that are like 12%. It's wild.
Yeah. So from what I have read, and maybe someone in the chat can correct me, or you can correct me if I'm wrong, the normal standard for Americans is like if you're going to get a mortgage, you put 5, 10, 20% down, and you get a 30-year fix. So generally for the 30 years that you're in that mortgage, your payments are pretty much the same, right?
Right.
Like month to month, like
They
whether
would
it's
be.
2020 or 27, It's the same amount, which benefits it benefits people who also have other assets because those assets are rising with inflation, and so their purchasing power relative to their mortgage is improving. It benefits people who are working at jobs with upward mobility because they're making more. In Canada, the system works so much more different, in the sense that number one, we don't have 30-year amortization periods. We have 25 generally. I think under special circumstances, you can get it longer, but we have 5-year terms. That is the standard. So you will pick a fixed rate for 5 years or a variable rate for 5 years, but no matter what, at the end of that 5 years, you will have to refinance. And so the way the real estate market has worked here is like we just have all these ticking time bombs going off, where it's just like
Right.
all the people pretty much in 2018 who got a mortgage are up now, and their monthly payment is skyrocketing, where else a lot of Americans don't have that issue. And it's like we also have a lot of rent control here too, to a much harsher degree than you have it in the States, where they're keeping like max rental increases to 2%. So being a real estate investor for passive income in Canada is just like that dream is pretty much dead outside of the cheapest places to live. Um,
Yeah.
and so I was trying to figure out, like, how did this develop this way? Like, why is it so different between the US and Canada? And why, with the system that we have, which seems a little bit more volatile over a longer period of time, did we end up so much better off than you guys in 2008? Because if I have a fixed mortgage payment, it's nice. I can project how much things are going to cost into the future. And the big thing I realized is this kind of steadiness, this 30-year amortization thing, was basically the reason that everything got securitized. And that's why they had all these tranches and everyone selling mortgages to one another, because it was like, oh, these things are just guaranteed. They're basically like bonds, right? People don't they don't foreclose on something that's going to be the same payment every year for 30 years. Like that's pretty easy. Just keep your job, right? So without recapping The Big Short, obviously that didn't work out. But what I didn't realize is that Canada doesn't do that. So in Canada, when you get a mortgage and it's like a 5-year term, your bank is very likely not repackaging it and selling it to another bank or a pension fund or whatever in some type of investment vehicle that has to be rated like triple B or triple A. We just didn't have that system here. So 40% of all mortgages were part of that system in the US in 2008. I don't know what it's like now. I imagine it's a little bit lower. But in Canada, it's like 2% or 3%. So it's much different. But, the environment in 2008 for housing is much different than it is now, because we've had just record rate rises. And so now it looks like the other way around, where we are way more at risk up here because everybody is refinancing. And so we have the interest rate volatility risk where you don't have it as much in your housing market. But to kind of spin this into like a final word in conversation, do you pay attention to the real estate market around you? And are you seeing, rate increases changing certain dynamics around you, or is it not really that big of a deal down where you are?
I am like within my personal network, I'm definitely seeing the effects of it. I have a lot of friends that back in 2018, 2019, even going into 2020, were, well off financially, making a significant amount of money and planning to buy a house. But as rates have gone up so drastically, they can't afford to do so. So, there's all kinds of numbers you can find online about like if you buy a house that's worth X amount, your payment would have been this, and now it's 10 times that. And so, even if you're making a decent income, it becomes very, very difficult to be able to afford whatever the mortgage would be. So,
Mhm.
I don't think I know anybody that has bought a house since, in the past 3 years, since 2020, since
Wow.
COVID happened. And I am in that age range where, everybody was buying a house, was looking to buy a house, has kids, and everybody's just sort of stuck now. Uh, the cost of living is really skyrocketing, and it is becoming a problem. We don't have any sort of rent control here. Or at least not anywhere that, I've never even met anybody that had a rent controlled apartment or living place. So, I think the effects of it really are significant. And
Mhm.
it's just pushing. the financial, the ability for people to own property, it's pushing it off and pricing people out. People who
Hmm.
should, like you said, it's kind of the opposite. In 2008, people who should not have had mortgages were getting approved for mortgages. And I think it's out of balance now in the sense that there are people who are earning significant income and have the money to afford a decently priced house, but there are no decently priced houses.
Yeah. And people are holding out because
Yeah.
they probably imagine that rates are going to come down at some point and go back, like people are waiting to buy the dip, maybe, sort of thing.
Yeah, kind of. And they're just priced out, even if they're making six figures, they don't want to pay, you know, a
Oh yeah, I
crazy
mean, like
mortgage
so
for
much of your payment is just getting pocketed by the bank. So it's
right,
like better
right.
to buy outright or off a mortgage if you can. And so like I kind of wonder, I think that's why the passive fund industry has grown so much in maybe the past few years, is because people are saying, well, I can't keep up with this housing market. I don't want to pay 7% interest, but I can't keep in cash. So the next logical conclusion is like passive funds, ETFs, right? Because the flows, even despite all the mania last year, like the flows are steadily increasing. And so people are just making the decision like hold off home ownership, but hitch, to a boat that's still moving in the right direction, which would be just the stock market at large.
Yeah. I agree,
Yeah.
and I think it's probably a smart decision. The all of the conversation about mortgages and interest rates has sort of sparked this conversation about, is it even worth it? Do you understand what you're getting into when you buy a house? And it's created more awareness, which I think is good. I certainly didn't ask any of those questions. I didn't really know what I was getting into, so
Yeah.
there's pros and cons to all of it.
Yeah. Everyone's situation is different. Um, well, I'll leave this on one note. One of the things that our super well designed government is doing is they're now putting out memos saying that banks should work to increase amortization period. So instead of having your mortgage and your payments assessed over a 25-year time frame or 30-year, we're talking about moving it to 50 and 70 years. And it's like it's everything that I think you feared in seeing the insides of the industries that you've worked in, this
Yeah.
perpetual renting of everything, and the idea that you would even table, a mortgage that will likely, you know, die, or you will likely die before it's paid off. That being tabled as a serious idea is really scary.
I totally agree. It's terrifying. And they really don't want you to own anything. They really don't. I mean, what other logical conclusion is there?
Yeah. All right. Well, I'll let you go, Michelle. I think we're right
All
on the
right.
nick of time for you, but appreciate being on. Where can people find you and your story? We'll have to do maybe a more formal interview so we can share your background. But you've
Sure.
done some great podcasts with Mark Moss, actually. So
Mark Moss was actually the very first podcast that I did.
that's such
Um,
like, it's so hard to top that.
well, yes and no. I don't recommend it
For a first
actually.
podcast.
Right, for your first podcast. And I was told it wasn't going to be live and came in live, and it was so yeah. Um, but I can be found on Twitter. I'm almost exclusively on Twitter at this point. I don't have any other social media
Oh,
really.
you're not on Threads yet? Come on, that's where all the action is.
No, and I won't be. And I'm glad that Elon is suing them, and I hope he wins. I
Nice.
don't I don't care if that's controversial. I'm anti meta.
Yeah, same here.
So, but
All
I'm on
right. So
Twitter. It's
yeah,
my name
at Michelle Weekly.
at Michelle Weekly. Yep.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much for coming on. Appreciate it.
Thank you for having me. It was really great to talk to you. I will talk to you again
Yeah.
soon.
Take care. See ya.
You too.
All right. And last little story here before we go off. Twitter is suing Meta. That was one of the stories over the last day. I mean, this whole Threads thing came together really fast. I kind of wonder if anybody here has any strong opinions on that. But it's very easy to say, oh, this is going to end up like Google plus social network or some other obscure social media attempt. But it is, the biggest social media company in the world launching this. And so, yeah, pass the question on to the chat in the comments section. Do you think this Threads social media Twitter clone by Facebook is going to pick up steam, or do you think it's going to die as a kind of a niche product? I personally made one thread. It was talking about how Bitcoin is the soundest money on earth and we should all embrace it. But that's just there for the history books. If Threads is still around 50 years from now, I can have my one thread that vocalizes my opinion, and hopefully it was right. But yeah, thanks so much everyone for tuning in. Really appreciate it. I hope you had fun today listening to us talk. It's great having guests here. If you watch this show and you like to talk and you got some great opinions, send me a message. We'll try and get you up maybe for one of these. And yeah, take care, stay sovereign, stack sats, and enjoy your weekend. Have a good one.